Here we go. Okay, so thank you everybody for popping back by. And today's class is going to be a class all about why God created the world. So we've been doing a lot of classes recently about how creation happens and different processes in the creation of all of reality. As it is called in Kabbalah, the Seder Hishtalshalos, the cosmic evolution of spiritual realms, which we've discussed a lot. And a lot of times the question of why did God even begin doing all of this in the first place, comes up. And there's many different opinions on this topic, as we'll be going through some of the sources. And even within contemporary scholars, you have people who seem to read the sources somewhat differently than others. And we'll be jumping into all of that. So thank you all for tuning in, and let's get straight into it. So today's question is going to be, does God need you? Why did God create us? So we're going to be looking into the question of why God even began to create us in the first place, and what the purpose, what that means for us in our day-to-day lives. What does that mean for us? Because God created us in this way. And we'll see that depending on the different approaches to this question, the answer is actually different. So we're going to have some sources over here from the Zohar today. The Zohar is the fundamental Kabbalistic writing, which is very famous, very known. Eitz Chaim, which is perhaps slightly less known, which is a book written by the Arizal, which is a very fundamental Kabbalist. And it was actually written by his student, but it's based off his teachings. We're going to have, actually missed out to mention, we're going to be mentioning also the Pardes, which is the teacher of the Arizal, the Ramak, and we're going to have the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe. And let's jump straight into all of these interesting topics. So this is a copy from an early manuscript of the Zohar. So what does the Zohar say about why did God create the world? So we'll dive straight into it in the original text. And obviously I'll be translating everything to make sure everybody understands everything. Everything could be understood clearly. So this is talking about after God creates the first image of what creation will all look like. Way up high in this godly realm, Nachis Taman, God, so to speak, descends into that. And he calls upon that image, his divine name, in order for creation to know God and his beautiful attributes. I added the word beautiful. So what the Kabbalah is saying over here is the Zohar. Why did God create the world? Why was everything created in the first place? Why was it created? In order for us to learn about God. So if you think about that for a second, it's actually quite interesting. What would that mean for us? What that would mean for us is that we should try to understand God and develop a relationship with him. And the question is, why did God do that? So obviously God is beyond needing anything. And God is being kind to creation by allowing us to connect to this revelation of God's glory, to be known. This is why God created the world, in order to be known. Now, the question is, why would God want to be known? So we said before that was from his kindness, from his goodness, that God wants to be kind to creation, to allow us to connect, to allow these small miniature beings to be able to connect with a beautiful infinite God. And this question of, so that's indeed perhaps one way you can look at it. But if you look at it a little deeper, so there's still a question of why. Why would God even do this in the first place? And we have an answer to this question in the Eitz Chaim, which is a book written by Rabbi Chaim Vital. And it's a teachings of the Arizal, as we mentioned before. So he says the question that everyone's trying to figure out: why did God create the world? And the reason why God created it is because God must be perfect. We all know that God must be perfect. God cannot be missing anything. And because God must be perfect, everything that is godly, anything that expresses anything about God, must also be perfect and must also be expressed. And if it's not expressed, then it's not going to be useful. Every single part of God is useful. And because God has these infinite abilities of expressing, so they must come into actuality. If God wouldn't have expressed all of these abilities that God has, then God wouldn't be considered perfect. God needs to be perfect. Perfect perfection includes the potential and actual. So it's not only that God could be nice, God could be kind, God could be known, God must be actually known because God is perfect. But there are, even with this approach, certain problems. And this is a picture of the Rebbe Rashab, which lived about a little over 100 years ago in Tsarist Russia. I believe actually the communist revolution happened in his lifetime, which was a very messy time to live in that area. And although he will present some problems with this approach, the answers that we've received before from the Zohar and the Eitz Chaim are obviously still true. They're true in the sense that once God creates the world does express God. Once God creates the world, once God creates the concepts of worlds, then once God creates the concept of expression, then indeed, those expressions must be expressed in order for them to be perfect. But God creates everything from his pure essence. There's nothing that exists that forces God's hand, so to speak, to need to do anything. And that's a writing, some of the manuscripts which he wrote his teachings in. And this is what the Rebbe Rashab writes. In truth, it's impossible to say that the reason why God created the world is in order to be perfect. That's a problem that only human beings have. Something which is potential. If you're able to express something, if you're able to express a creation, a piece of art, and you don't, it's only a problem for humans if you don't go ahead and express that. But for God, God is perfect. You can't say that that issue, so to speak, exists within God. God is not like humans. Human potential is worthless without outcome. It's very true. And why is that? Because let's say I could be a good friend. I'm such an amazing guy. I can be everybody's best friend. You're an amazing guy. You can be everybody's best friend. If you don't go out and make friends, if you don't go out and be nice to other people, then very nice, but who cares? That's worthless. Nobody cares about that. If you're a genius, but you don't learn anything, or you haven't studied anything, you haven't used your brain in the art of geniosity, of invention, of discovery, then it's useless. It's not worth anything. If you're a builder, you say, I'm a very strong guy. I can build buildings. I can be an amazing architect. If you haven't done it, then very nice. Nobody really cares. And this idea is actually not only brought in very modern Kabbalah, as we mentioned before, the Rebbe Rashab was only about 100 years ago, but even the Pardes, which is the teacher of the Arizal, writes this, and you actually might find that it's a bit similar to the concept which we found in the Rambam, which was actually in our last live stream. God's thoughts are not like our thoughts. God's ways are not like our ways. When a human being wants to make something, your mind, your thought, cannot bring actuality. You can imagine what this house will look like. You can imagine what this party will look like. You can imagine a whole bunch of different things in your mind, how you're going to make a building, how you're going to build a chair, or whatever it is, a computer. But your thoughts are not going to create anything. But it's not like that with God. And why do we have these problems as humans? In order for your potentials to have any value, they need to come into actuality. Because potential, thoughts, lack reality. And it has no worthiness other than in the realm of ideas. The main thing for us as human beings in this physical world is action. But it's not like that with God. When God thought the idea of creation, the entire creation immediately existed. And you might find this similar to what we were speaking about in the Rambam in the last live stream, as I mentioned, that God controls and creates all of reality from his thought, from his ability to understand and know of knowledge. When God knows something, it becomes in existence. So when God thinks something, it becomes in existence. That's how God creates, with his thoughts. So you can't say that God has the same problem as us humans, that God, in order for him to be considered perfect, needs to go ahead and create. That's what the Pardes is really saying over here. And now we're going to get a bit deeper into what the Rebbe Rashab was saying. God's infinite radiance finds fuller expression in higher realms within God himself. And let's think about that for a second. We know that those of us who've studied some of the Kabbalistic classes that we've done in the past, we know that there are a lot of these different realms. The physical world is the last world, the world of action. But there's these spiritual realms where there's angels that exist, and there's even higher spiritual realms which are beyond angels. They're the potential of all existence. They're, so to speak, where God created all of existence within himself before he actually goes on and created. Like we said before, God creates from his understanding, from his imagination, from his thought. So when we exist within God's imagination, before we exist and see ourselves as identified beings and separate beings from God, we exist, so to speak, in a potential form within God. Now, when we exist within God, we're perfect. We're perfect like God's perfection. We're within God's imagination. We have this infinite, we have this infinity to us. So we're more godly. If you would say that the reason God created the world is in order to express his perfection, well, then actually, the way we exist within God's imagination is much more perfect and much more expressive. There's much more godly revelation within those higher, there's much more godly revelations within those higher spiritual realms than there is here in our physical world. So to say that God needs to create this physical world in order to be expressed doesn't make any sense, because God is less expressed in this world than he is in these higher spiritual worlds. And if you're not familiar with the Kabbalistic realms, this might be perhaps slightly harder to grasp and understand, but the next stages of this class will actually be something that anybody can understand it, although it will be deep. And then the question becomes, why did God even express to begin with? What's the real cause, the real purpose? In other words, it's nice to say that when God's imagination comes to create, so in order for that imagination to be considered perfect, it needs to actually be expressed. Okay, fine. But then why did God even do that to begin with? Why is a perfect, infinite God interested in creations? The answer is there's no reason, but don't get scared. We'll see that this no reason is actually very deep and much more powerful than any reason than you could have thought of. I'm just going to show you from the sources. We don't know a logical reason why God would want to create a world. And that's because God created from his essence without reason. In other words, and we're going to be seeing more details about how significant this is shortly, there is no cause. If we would say that God created the world from his potentials, so imagine a human being. You're smart, you have all this potential to learn. So in order for you to be considered smart, in order for you to actuate your knowledge, you need to actually go ahead and learn. In order for you to be considered a good builder, you need to actually go ahead and build. So in other words, there's a cause and there's effect. There's the fact that you have the potential to do all these amazing things, and that is the cause which actually brings forth what will come out. But with God, there is no cause, because creation comes from God's essence. There's no reason, there's no cause, and there's no need. God is not forced to do anything. Now we're going to look into a little bit of the texts of the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, from this generation, a leader in this generation. If creation would be because of a reason, if creation would be for a reason, then what would that mean? That would mean that creation, so to speak, has an advantage over God in that space where God needs creation. If God needed to create all of creation in order for us to know him, then what if we don't learn about God? What if we don't fulfill that mission? Then what does that mean? That means that God is missing something without us. And then we would be considered, so to speak, miniature gods, God forbid, because we, so to speak, have this small power over God. But the real true reason of creation, which is simply not in order to achieve something that God was missing, rather, because this is just what God wanted, without a purpose, without a cause, and without a reason. So it turns out, so it turns out that the only reason, the only thing which comes out of God's creation is simply the fact that God wanted to create it. That's it. There's nothing within creation that God is missing, so to speak. It's just an expression of God in essence. This is what I'm doing. This is what I want to do. This is from my essence what I desire to do. And we're going to see soon how this is very deep and very meaningful, not soon, but shortly. And that's the source. If you want to peek, look at the Sichas Chelek above. So now, if we view it in this way, we're going to find pros and cons. The pros are that God remains perfect. God remains unaffected. But then the cons are that we are seemingly meaningless in essence. Perhaps, as we said before, we said that if we learn about God, at least we can have some sort of relationship with God, but it's not like God has any interest in this relationship with us. It's just that we can learn about God. Okay, cool. And then the question is this a mistake? Like, if God didn't create us to fulfill a certain purpose, if God would create us to fulfill a certain purpose, then it would sound like, okay, so God created us in the form to fulfill that purpose, to fulfill that need which God needed, right? Like, let's say if you need to eat, so you eat purposely, you go ahead and eat because you need to eat. But if God doesn't need to eat, he's just doing things like what did God just command a creation, and like whatever happens, and like God doesn't really care? Is that the situation? Over here we have a picture of the Rebbe, because we are right now studying his teachings, his thoughts, his deep Kabbalistic concepts. And the answer is, it's not a mistake. It's not meaningless. In fact, it's very deep and very meaningful, far more meaningful than what we could have imagined without thinking of it in this way. All right. Let me read this. The purpose of the entire creation is just the fact that God in his essence desired creation. So when we fulfill our purpose in this world, we are fulfilling a desire which comes purely from God's essence without any knots tied into it. Comes from his essence without a cause. Okay, I'm sorry. This is from previous context. Let me read the rest. When, so there's one part that I skipped, and that is that what is God desiring? God, the words that Kabbalah uses over here is God is desiring for us to make this world a dwelling place for God's essence. So God obviously is not homeless. God doesn't need a home. Imagine somebody was building a home because he's homeless. Without a home, he'll be vulnerable. Okay, so that means he needs the home. Fine. And then whoever's building that home for him is doing it for whatever reason that this person needs, and perhaps the person is paying him. So then it would kind of sound like, okay, God wants us to make this world a dwelling place for him, and God is going to give us benefits. But God doesn't really need us in essence. God just wants us to build him a home. No, that's not what this means. What this means is that God is looking to connect in an essential way with creation, a home for his essence. In other words, without any knots tied to it. The purpose is God's essence. And therefore, when we come to look how we can build our relationship with God, how we can connect to God, we shouldn't look for reasons why God wants us to connect. Because if we try to think about, why does God want me? What am I special? Oh, I'm special because I'm human, because I'm smart. And God wants me to use my wisdom to serve him. No, that's not the way we should look at it. We should look at it, God created us from his essence, and he gave us soul, which comes directly from his essence. And God wants to connect with me and with all of this reality in essence. And he gave me a mission to connect with him in his essence by making this world a refined place. And it's not that God needs this to happen. It's that this is coming from God's essence. It's like a free will, a, a, a free choice, so to speak, which God makes in order to simply do this purpose. It's a very deep topic, which really does require a lot of thought. And we're going to actually be giving some ideas over here, how we can think of this to actually understand what this means. And this purpose contains God's entire essence. If God would be doing it for something that he needs, then God's essence would not be involved. The only thing that would be involved would be what God needs. And then we fulfill that need, and we have no essential connection with God. But since there's no reason here, we can connect to God in essence. And what is an essential desire? So, in order to really understand this, I'm thinking of contrasting the two topics of deep versus sophisticated. What's the difference between something which is deep versus something which is sophisticated? Um, now I'm gonna. So something which is sophisticated means there's a lot of details. There's a lot of things that we need to understand in order to figure out, to get to the bottom of the topic. And the more sophisticated something is, the more complicating it is, and the harder it is to get all of those details and really gather a perfect picture. But something which is deep is actually slightly different. It's almost like moving away all of the things which are blocking you from understanding this deep idea. So sophisticated means gathering all of the details, all the problems, and putting them on the table and organizing them so you can actually understand it perfectly. And deep is really moving away all of the things which are blocking you from really understanding this concept so that you can see it, and it simply shines on you. When you see when you understand something deep, it's almost like, yeah, it's obvious. It was just sitting there all along. I just needed to reveal what that is. So let's think about it in relationships. What's a deep relationship? A deep relationship is when we remove all of the blockades we have between us and another person, and we simply connect with that person. And what's a sophisticated relationship? I would say a sophisticated relationship is a person which has a lot of reasons, a lot of details with which he connects with somebody else. Um, there's, let's say, well, I'm connected to this person because he was my teacher. He taught me how to do this, and he was my teacher. He taught me how to do that, and he's also very kind to me, and he buys me food all the time, and he smiled to me a lot of times. That would perhaps be called a relationship which is made up of details, a lot of different things that build a connection. And it might be a strong connection, but it's still a lot of things. And if we take away those things, then that connection is going to be dissolved. But a deep connection is when we simply remove all of the layers which create social blocks, and we simply connect with another person in essence. It's just, we're going to connect in essence, what we really are, one to the other. And it's similar to this with God's essential desire, an essential connection that God wants to have with all of creation. An essential desire doesn't have things in it. It doesn't have needs in its only purity of self. So it's not that God needed something from us and we're coming to fulfill it. It's that God is himself purely perfect on his own. And God creates us from that perfect essence that he is to make this world a pure and good place. Not that God needs that, but that this is how we connect to him in essence. We fulfill this essential desire. And when we think of it in this way, we suddenly don't start thinking of ourselves as special people, which, God needs something from us. We think of it differently. We think of it, God essentially wants to connect to us in essence without any blockades. And we need to remove all of these blockades in order to reveal that connection. And this is the source for this specific idea. God's desire, God's purpose for creating this world in order for us to create a dwelling place within this world for God, because God programmed this world in a way that God cannot dwell within a world which is full of different evil things and human and basic temptations. God wants to dwell in a world of purity, and he tasked us with refining this world and allowing his essence to be connected with us in essence in this physical world by purifying it and making it a nicer and a better place spiritually speaking. Move on, it is understood it is understood that this that God desired to create this world is only because of God's will and choice, not because of a reason. Because God's essential existence itself is completely void of any descriptions. God is completely perfect, infinite, and even infinity and perfect are not really the right way for us to speak about God. It's not possible to say that God has this tendency to want to relate to a specific type of thing. No, God is completely pure in essence, and this is what God wants from us, without a purpose and without a reason. And this is actually a snip from a source that we showed earlier, and we're just going to show it again. The whole idea of us creating this, making this world a dwelling place for God, it's not that God needs it. It's just because God desired in his essence. And with that, we complete this class about desire. How privileged we are that God will want a connection with each and every one of us. And now I'm just going to, now you can write your questions in the comments. I'm staying around for, another minute. See if any questions come in. I just wanted to address that I've spoken with a lot of, different scholars about this topic, and some like to stress the idea that that God needs us. It sounds like God is missing something. But really what they mean to say is not that God is missing something without us, rather that the purpose that we have in this world is much deeper than any of the fake things that we have in this world. What is something that we need as humans? We need to eat and we need to drink. Yes, that's true. Without eating and drinking, we cannot live. So it's not that God cannot live, so to speak, without us connecting to him in this world. It's that God created this world from his deepest essence. And I've also spoken to some scholars which seemed to have a problem with saying that this desire is coming from God's essence, but that was obviously clearly very clear from what we saw in these sources. Does God want to share? God wants to do exactly what was created. God wants us to make this world a dwelling place for God in his essence. Now, essentially, that's something that doesn't make sense. How can we make a physical world a dwelling place for God's essence? God's essence is completely beyond this. But nonetheless, that is God's pure desire from within his essence. And the whole point is that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't need to make sense. It's completely beyond any reason and any need. So it's not that God necessarily wants to share or needs to share. It's that God programmed the entire reality in the way that it expresses his perfect essence. Now, we could say that since God in his essence shined this desire to go ahead and create, that infinite expression of God is programmed in a way that it now must share. So now, when God's infinite expression goes ahead and creates and imagines creation, it is indeed fulfilling a need that that expression had. Because since this expression is coming from God's essence, and God's essence sent, so to speak, this expression to create all of reality, so therefore this expression wants to share its light because this is what God programmed it to do. And I hope that sheds some light on this whole topic. And I hope to see you guys more in future coming live streams. And I'd love to get all of your questions in the comments below. And please don't hesitate. And again, reminder, if you'd like to help us out here at Kabbalah Demystified, you can buy me a coffee. Check in the link in the description, buymeacoffee.com, or you can become a Patreon monthly member. That'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and see you again.